On this video, I am going to be reacting and doing a critique on some terrible landscape photography. And this is going to be just from one landscape photographer who will be quite unfortunate, but I do hope he doesn't feel too bad after. Let's get right onto the first image. Now, this one was taken on a river in Gabaldon, Nueva Ecija. And I can really see a lot of potential in this scene, but perhaps one of the first things to learn when it comes to being a landscape photographer, especially for beginners, is that we should hold back a bit on post-processing because this one could have been a really good image. It's just that there was so much effort into making it clear and making it detailed to the point that the image was just totally lost. And I hope by now you do understand that these images that I'm doing a critique on are images taken by myself. And if anything, it would be important for anyone who's starting in photography to really look back at their old images years back. The photos on this video were taken during my first 2 to 3 years in landscape photography, and I make it a habit to revisit my old files whenever I can so that I can also compare and maybe update, especially when I have the raw files intact with me. So for this one, generally, I just want to show you guys that less is more when it comes to post-processing, unless of course you're doing a very meticulously done composite. But if not, try and get every image taken properly during the capture itself and do not do so much post-processing. Or at the very least, try and see the limitations of your post-processing method. This next image was taken in the village of Bangaan in the province of Ifugao, and honestly, this is one of my favorite places to shoot in the Philippines. If you know of the Banawe rice terraces, this is one of the rice terraces near it. And if you do visit the Ifugao region, you should take a look at and try and see as many of the beautiful rice terraces that there are in the region. But yeah, this is one of my favorites. I can vividly remember shooting this image because I went down maybe a good 300 to 500 steps just to capture this image. And I was struck by the different colors of the crops and that they were giving such amazing contrast. But I do realize that I made some mistakes, specifically in shooting and in processing this image. So for one, at the time I was so obsessed with color and I wanted everything to be saturated and everything to pop out when it can actually ruin an image, specifically when you're overemphasizing color. You might take away some attention from the essence of the image, from the composition or the general content of what is there. And during this time, I wasn't even open to the thought of replacing the sky. And as you can see on this image, it was a very gloomy, very cloudy day. And that's also the reason why I really tried to pop out the colors. But I did revisit this image and this is what I made it to be. I replaced the sky and also added some sun rays and gave it a bit more texture with some patch lighting. And of course, I'm happier with the updated image, and I do think that there's so much more that can be done, but I'm really waiting for the opportunity to go back to that place and shoot it again. This next shot I also took from that river in Nueva Ecija. We were there a lot because the landscape photography workshop where I started, it was called Chasing Light. And we were there quite a lot during that time because I joined the workshops multiple times and also helped out for the succeeding batches. And I was particularly fond of that location because it's also near a very nice boulder beach. And yeah, that is why a lot of the landscape images that I had early on were taken from this place. And there's literally nothing in the foreground. There are rocks around, but it would be a bit too much to try and get them to form something in the foreground. I remember an older photographer who was kidding around during that time when we were shooting because it seemed like we were making a catalog of these rocks. But for this particular image, you can see that for a time I was so obsessed with shooting sun rays to the point that a lot of my images had sun rays but were not properly balanced. You can see a patch of white right behind the sun rays here, and more importantly, there isn't any foreground that just, there's just nothing that makes this image harmonic. And that's very important to me now because I realize that we should not be overly obsessed about certain elements in an image, like for this one, the sun rays, to a point wherein we forget the more fundamental parts of an image, which is, of course, for this one, composition. So at the time, I would have thought this was a great image because of the sun rays, but I totally forgot that there's nothing else in it except for the sun and the blue sky. This next image was taken in Bolinao in Pangasinan, and it's quite an amazing place to be shooting seascapes because the rock formations there are just amazing. And there is a beach right there where you can find also a cliff. So you can be able to shoot from down below at the beach and also up the cliff to be able to get a bit more perspective of the seascape. And the waves here are pretty strong, so it's really nice to practice some long exposure. But for this particular shoot, I can say I really messed up. Or maybe at the very least, I overdid in post-processing and I wasn't cautious enough when it comes to my composition and the effect that I was trying to achieve with long exposure. So you can see that there is some brushing movement on the water, but the problem is that they're too cluttered. The brushing effect on the water is just underwhelming to the point that instead of giving us some direction, it actually just makes everything chaotic because the pattern isn't emphasized as much as we want. And another thing was, I'm pretty sure I was also gunning for some sun rays or a starburst on this image, but the sun was covered by quite a lot of clouds. So we can only see a very faint and very distant setting sun right here. And I realized that one of the biggest mistakes that I did here was I did not bracket my exposure. At the time, I wasn't even open to that method. But when I was shooting this, I really wanted there to be details on the rocks on both sides. So the problem is that I wanted the effect, but I did not want to do the method. So I wish I did do a bracket of the exposure to be able to get the details on the rocks and not just pull out the details using the shadow slider and just try to bring out what's not even there and bring out more noise. And you can see that on this image, the worst crime that I did is that I overdid the sharpening and the clarity as well. So you can see some halo on the sides. And I've even tried to go back to the raw file of this image, but it's just one of those that cannot be saved anymore. Now, before I do the last image, I want to say that if you do want me to give some comments on your own landscape images, then feel free to send them over on my Instagram and I can do a critique video like this. Now, I've done a lot of workshops in the past wherein I incorporated something like this. That's very helpful because you're able to give so much information just by trying to see what can be improved. And that, I think, is the pinnacle of constructive criticism. And it's also something that's nice to be done with group workshops because, of course, the learning is multiplied depending on how many participants there are and how many photos are going to be taken a look at. Now, on to the last image. This one was, of course, taken from the iconic Banawe rice terraces, specifically from what they call viewpoint, or the most iconic location to be shooting the Banawe rice terraces in Ifugao. And I remember this day like it happened yesterday. I was with an old mentor, John Chua, who brought me to Banawe for some advocacy projects. But he also really wanted me to be able to shoot the landscapes of the Ifugao because this was I think the height of me learning and shooting a lot of landscapes. So he really wanted to support me on that. And I remember we woke up very early on this day because we traveled a good 8 or 10 hours to Banawe. And when we got there, before even grabbing some breakfast, we went to this location and started shooting. And we didn't have a lot of time, so this was actually shot handheld. And the only thing that I had aside from my camera was a graduated neutral density filter. And at the time, I was so obsessed with long exposure. And I thought that every one of my shots should be done in long exposure for no reason at all. And I wasn't able to do long exposure on this one. I didn't even have time to set up my tripod. And I thought that I missed an opportunity. But really, in this shot, there's not much movement. And if I did long exposure, the sun rays would have been erased by the movement. So I think this scene was actually perfect to begin with. I think this was the majestic Banawe rice terraces giving me a warm welcome. It's just that during this time I thought I had to stick to a certain rigid workflow and do long exposures and whatnot. And this is one of those instances wherein I was very thankful that I was shooting in RAW and not in JPEG because I was able to revisit it to come up with this. And as you can see, this is a more tamed version, a more refined version, and it just really gives you that majestic feel of the grand landscape and also a bit of nostalgia if you've been to the place. So there, I hope you learned from this video. I hope you learned from my mistakes. And I'm being very open with my mistakes because I do think that if there's anything that people can learn from my photography, it's that there are so many mistakes to learn from in your process. So if you have photos that are not good to your standards right now, don't worry about it. If you have photos that you think were a waste of time, don't worry about it. Because the important thing is that you are able to identify your mistakes and try and see how you can correct it. Just like what I do almost every month, I revisit old photos and I'm able to come out happier with the newly revised edits of those photos. If not, of course, there are also times wherein you just have to go back. And once the pandemic is over, I'm absolutely going back to these places to take another shot. Now again, don't forget to leave your comments down below if you have any questions, or send me your photos for critique on my Instagram and I'll be doing a follow-up video. And of course, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe to this channel.